folks. I am Gideon Marcus. Oh, please, please. No, that's too much. So I'm Gideon Marcus, and I am a time traveler. So all the people in this room, you are master's degrees or PhDs. You spent the better part of a decade going to school. You may still be in school. And all I had to do to be up here was create a time machine. So this is it. In fact, if you have those little pocket computers, those little phonavacs that are in your pockets, you can go pull them out. Pull them out, everybody, pull them out. I know you all have, you're addicted to these things. Good God. In the 60s, we just have black and white television. If you go to galacticjourney.org, is this too loud? Is this the right level? Good level? Okay. If you go to galacticjourney.org, you will see the presence that we maintain. What it is a time portal to exactly 55 years ago. What does that mean? It moves. So right now it is May 17th, 1967. Jimi Hendrix has just come out with an album, which is amazing. Hemlines are up to here. Star Trek just finished its first season and is in its summer reruns. Not everything is great. In as many months, we've lost 4 spacemen on both sides of the Iron Curtain in the Apollo 1 and the Soyuz 1 catastrophes. Right now, there are 500,000 American soldiers in South Vietnamese and countless hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese fighting hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese for some nameless hills somewhere in the center of their country. We have racial injustice. We have people marching for their rights. And I'm sure things will be completely different in 55 years. Warfare will be a thing of the past. We will have complete racial harmony and justice. Oh, and if you're wondering why I'm wearing a mask, and I see you're all wearing masks, so I assume the smog problem has not been solved in 55 years. Is that correct? So that's what I do. And if you're wondering how I do it, if you go to my house, I live in Vista, California, which is a lovely suburb of San Diego. It is a bubble back in time. If you tune into the radio station near my house, I won't give you the frequency because I don't want the FCC coming after me. It actually plays that wonderful music you heard. And by the way, everyone can tune in if you go to the website. We have a TV station that plays exactly what happened 55 years ago, which is a mixed blessing because on one hand, we get Mission Impossible and Star Trek and I Spy, and on the other hand, we get Gilligan's Island. The vast wasteland, as FCC Chair Nelson Minow said a few years ago. And we've got people coming in. This is why I'm vamping, by the way, so everyone can come in and get the meat of this performance. So the times are very similar. The times are very different in some ways, but they're very similar. And if there's one thing that unites the era of 1967 and 2022, it's that we are both seeking the answer to the eternal question, is there intelligent life on planet Earth? I imagine the jury is still out from the laughter. But we're also hoping that somewhere out there may be smart aliens that have figured things out a bit better than we have. And so that is what this talk is going to be about, because everyone here is an astrobiologist, an exobiologist, some kind of out of this solar system, or maybe planetary biologist. But you may not be completely familiar with the context of what your field was like in the 60s, particularly the public perception thereof. So begins our tour, and we will begin with a journey through the solar system. This is, for those of you who do not look up, the moon. And even as of 1960, we had a pretty good idea what the moon was like. Even in the 1800s, we knew that there was likely no atmosphere around this moon. We figured there probably were not any beings living on this planet. But at the same time, it was close and it was compelling, and so science fiction authors, even at the dawn of our genre, were writing stories about it. This is the first one that I know that is a truly science fiction deserving the label of aliens on the moon. And the way they justify there being an alien presence on the moon was the idea that there are times when the sun is just right on the moon and the volatiles evaporate, and for a little while you have a breathable atmosphere. So H.G. Wells wrote about life on the moon. Alien life, intelligent life. Edgar Rice Burroughs, who gallivanted about our solar system in prose, also posited that there were people on the moon, but he understood that the moon was a lifeless husk on the surface, and so he assumed that there was, in fact, an empty space within the moon and people lived on the underside, which is interesting. Are there any Edgar Rice Burroughs fans in this room? We have a few. Edgar Rice Burroughs also posited that there was a hollow earth and people living inside that. It was called Pellucidar, and those are some of my favorite stories. So there's a whole, I think it's 4 books set on the moon that deal with this internal surface of the moon. Obviously fancy. Movies. Movies are always a little bit behind the science. So we have Missile to the Moon, which, you know, it takes place on an airless moon, and yet look at all the scattering of the light and the shadows. But, you know, this movie was not really made so much for the scientific accuracy, but as an opportunity to showcase the Miss America pageant contestants. But there are fun little aliens on it. And if you ever watch Amazon Women on the Moon, which is a wonderful send-up in the 80s by the people who made Kentucky Fried Movie in the 70s, they've got a wonderful send-up of this movie starring Steve Forrest called Amazon Women on the Moon. Absolutely worth your time. It's worth coming just for that recommendation. All right, well, why stop at Miss America? So before it became legal to display pornography in any theater, you could only film nude films at a nudist colony. So why not combine this burgeoning sci-fi field of movies with nude colonies, and thus was born the Nudie Cutie features. Very scientifically accurate. This is what we presume aliens would look like on the moon if in fact they had nudist colonies. All right, so by 1967, we had a pretty good idea what the moon was like. We'd sent several lunar orbiter craft. Right now, as we speak in 1967, there are 4, although I believe one has already crashed into the moon. We've crashed Rangers into the moon, several of them. And we've landed a couple of these guys. These are surveyors. And you can see Surveyor returning a self-portrait of its foot, which is sort of reminiscent of how my daughter used to take pictures. And from this, we gathered that the surface of the moon was something that Apollo astronauts could land on. And we are predicting in 1967, even with the catastrophe that took the lives of 3 astronauts, that we will be on the moon before this decade is out. So, of course, once you have the moon this mapped and this understood, there's not going to be any ridiculous movies like in, say, 2022 that get the science all wrong. I'm assured on that, right? I can be optimistic about the future, right? Okay. All right, so having exhausted the moon as an abode for life, let's go to the planets. So this is Mercury, first from the sun, and I imagine there's not a lot of people here who have seen Mercury. Raise your hand if you've actually seen Mercury. Got a few, good for you. It's hard to see Mercury because it's closest to the sun, which means it never gets much elongation from it. Unlike Venus, which goes up to, I think, 45 degrees or so, Mercury is always within, I think, 12. So you can see it at sunset and sunrise if you're looking for it. Because of this, because a lot of people couldn't see Mercury, and when they could, it was often in glare, and it was far away, it was sort of wishful thinking when they came up with maps for the moon. And they really didn't know how fast it rotated. In 1963, people still assumed, because they kept seeing the same markings on Mercury, that either it had a 24-hour rotation, which was awfully coincidental, although Mars does too, or it presented one face to the sun, which makes sense. Something that close to the sun should be tidally locked. And as late as 1964, a certain famous science fiction author released his first story called The Coldest Place, which posited that Mercury would in fact not only be the hottest place in the solar system, but also the coldest, because its backside was always presented to the sun, which was unique amongst all the planets. And this author posited that there would be life based on helium-2 superfluid liquid. It was a pretty neat story. Raise your hand if you happen to be this author who wrote this story. Larry Niven, ladies and gentlemen. Round of applause. I could not have asked for a better prop for this talk. I did not know Larry Niven would be in the audience right now, so thank you for being accommodating. So Mercury is very, so before we understood Mercury's rotation, when we thought it was a one-faced world, this is what we thought it was like. We knew it was airless. We thought there might be a twilight region where the temperature might be inhabitable, and maybe there was something you could do with that. If not natively, maybe it'd be a good place to live. We found out right around the time Larry Niven wrote this story using radar that the moon actually rotates 3 times for every 2 orbits. It does not present one face of the sun, and this conception of Mercury does not exist, cannot exist, and in fact, Mercury must be lifeless. Let's go to the next planet. This is like vacation slides. And then I went to the Eiffel Tower. So this is Venus, and this is about as good as Venus looks from terrestrial telescopes. This is, as of 1962, the best look we had of what we called Earth's twin. And we called it that because, of course, similar gravity. It had thick clouds. We didn't know what those clouds were made of. And so there were 2 competing theories as to what the surface of Venus looked like. One was that Venus was a hot, desolate desert, a bit like El Centro, where I grew up in Southern California, perhaps more culture. And on the right, a steaming ocean. Now, steaming oceans are a bit more appealing to science fiction authors, and so that's the one that tended to get used the most. So you've probably read Ray Bradbury's All Summer in a Day. I think that was mandatory reading when we were kids. And Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, made it Amtor, also set on an oceanic Venus. So Venus was a fairly popular setting for a while until Mariner 2, the first interplanetary probe, went in 1962. And in the end of 1962, returned data and found that Venus seared at a good 800 degrees, and it was impossible that there could be any liquid water on the planet. Now, this didn't stop Carl Sagan from positing that there were ways to terraform the planet. And this was right about the time that Carl Sagan was starting to make his transition from astrophysicist to science popularizer. But nevertheless, the Venus that we knew was gone. Or was it? Interestingly enough, the idea of an oceanic, inhabitable Venus was so compelling that many big authors continued to write about it as if it existed. So Robert Silverberg set some stories there in the Blue Fire series. Roger Zelazny has this one. It's sort of a Hemingway-esque story, but it takes place on Venus. It's big fish hunting on Venus. This is 1966. People should know better. But Zelazny was a big author and made more money than me, so what do I know? I will say the first person to put a story in a realistic Mariner 2-based Venus was, again, Larry Niven with his Filmed in Hell, which actually appeared in fantasy and science fiction, I think the same year, maybe the year before. And I always say writing using science is sexier than writing ignoring science, but what do I know? Next planet. This is Mars, looking about as good as it ever does from terrestrial telescopes. It's an enigmatic, compelling planet, isn't it? It's kind of green. It changes with the seasons. It's very Earth-like in terms of its rotation and its axial tilt. So clearly Mars, if we're going to look for life anywhere, it's going to be Mars. And I have to ask, how many folks here are Mars astroexobiologists? We have a few. After the show, I want to know what got you into looking for life on Mars. Because I can tell you what got the first generation was this guy, Schiaparelli, an Italian astronomer who made the first real maps of Mars. And you'll notice he's got those really interesting straight lines on there, which he called in Italian canali, which means channels. But Percival Lowell, who we know from his search for Planet X, which eventually became Pluto, translated it as canals. And the difference between channel and canal is natural versus artificial. And the world went nuts. There must be intelligent life on Mars. Mars is further from the sun than Venus. Earth is further from the sun than Venus. Clearly, we are seeing the evolution of the solar system in the distance of the planets from the stars. So Mercury is the youngest planet. It hasn't cooled down yet. Venus is still a primeval swamp the dinosaurs lived in. Earth is Earth. And Mars is an ancient planet with an old advanced civilization on it. The kind that might send aliens to Earth to declare war only to be felled by a bug, presumably COVID-18. I guess that would be COVID -50 or something. So we have a lot of stories set on Mars. Some of them are rather romantic. So for instance, we have Lee Brackett, who is a very famous screenwriter. Everyone know who Lee Brackett is? If you don't, look her up because she's super important, not just in the 40s, but beyond. She actually wrote the first draft of the script to The Empire Strikes Back. She also wrote The Treasure of Sierra Madre, which I believe won an Oscar. But in her Sea Kings of Mars, her heroes are transported back in time a few million years to when Mars was an inhabitable wet planet. Mars Child by Cyril Judd, that's actually Judith Merrill and Cyril Kornbluth, who were big authors in the early 50s. This is a story about colonists on a more Earth-like Mars, or more realistic. It has a thin atmosphere, it's more grounded in science, and it's about the rigors and the interesting results of childbirth on another planet and what might the next generation of colonists on an unusual planet look like. The Mars they write about is not the Mars that we know today, but it is an interesting scientifically based world, and I think it's a story that's still worth reading. It's called Mars Child there, but Lisa, what was it called in that sensational book of yours? Sin in Space. Woman taking her sweater off, guy very excited about the situation. Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, made Mars very popular, and I believe in the 2010s or so, you're going to have a set of movies based on John Carter of Mars, or as he called it, Barsoom. So Mars figures huge in science fiction all the way up through the 50s, and even into the 60s. But, of course, illusions are made to be broken. And in 1964, Mariner 4 was the first probe to successfully pass by Mars. The Soviet Union sent some that didn't make it, or didn't have their cameras on anyway, which doesn't do any good. Mariner 4 determined in its 22 pictures that Mars looked like the surface of the moon, and everyone came to the conclusion that Mars was an airless, worthless hulk, which is interesting because yes, it's true that Mars had less than 1% of Earth's atmospheric density, but you know what? Earth has about 1% the density of Venus's atmosphere, and if there were any Venusians, they would be looking at Earth going, God, what a terrible airless vacuum place. So it wasn't until after the 60s that we started to say, well, maybe Mars isn't so bad. But this is, in 1967, pretty much the nadir of interest in Mars. Even though, it's interesting, I read an article just a couple of years ago from my perspective, that talked about how they expected Mars to be heavily cratered. So the fact that it has craters and not so much weathering is not that surprising. But in 1964, it seemed like, or 65, it seemed like everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Thank God there isn't anything on Mars. Maybe they knew Tom Cruise was going to star in a movie. All right, so we go to the other planets. Is there life on Jupiter? Could there be? Did people think that there was life on Jupiter? So Jupiter is a hostile environment, and we did know a bit about it. We certainly knew its density, we knew its temperature. But there was the possibility that beneath the cloud tops, it could be warm enough or congenial enough to support some kind of alien life. So, of course, Edgar Rice Burroughs. Why is everyone laughing? Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote this. This is actually a late Edgar Rice Burroughs story, which means it's not one of his better ones. So he made Jupiter inhabitable by having hot volcanoes keep everything warm, like Indonesia, I guess, and the speed of Jupiter's rotation mitigating the gravity with centrifugal force. You have to give him credit for originality. In a more realistic vein, we have Poul Anderson, someone I'm sure Larry Niven knew very well. Poul Anderson was a science fiction author whose work was far more rooted in science, very hard science. And he wrote a story under the name of Winston Sanders a couple of years ago, from my perspective, called Three Worlds to Conquer. And it posited that there was life on Jupiter on some sort of cold, rocky core under the thick atmosphere. The only problem with this book is it's not very good. But the aliens are interesting. All right. Saturn, pretty planet. But there's not much you can do with Saturn that you can't do with Jupiter. And because Saturn is clearly more hostile than Jupiter, not a lot of people wrote stories about Saturn. Even less hospitable, and no, I will not make a butt joke, the seventh planet. You can pronounce it yourself. Grow up. You would think that this planet would not be the subject of science fiction, and yet, a few years ago, there was this one. I believe it was translated from the Danish, Journey to the Seventh Planet. And they go to the planet and they find a completely Earth-like environment. Turns out it's actually an artificial creation, and that little monster in the bottom left is sending out mind waves to ensnare people with beautiful women to trap the stalwart spacemen. It's actually not a bad movie, but it is the only one I know that takes place on Uranus. And then finally, we get to the edge of the solar system, Neptune and Pluto. Neptune on the left, Pluto on the right. And obviously, those are so far out, we do not expect to see any kind of life there. So as of 1967, we've exhausted the solar system as an abode for life. Is there any other place in the solar system where life might exist? Let's not always see the same hands. The moons. So at the time, we knew that Jupiter had a bunch of big moons, and so we have Doc Smith, one of the deans of science fiction, writing a pulpy story about aliens from Ganymede. And then we have Titan. Titan we knew had an atmosphere, and a significant atmosphere. And Alan Norse wrote an interesting story set under the clouds of Titan. The life was incidental to the story. It was mostly a hard science fiction about colonization and mining. But the aliens were there. And Titan, over the next few decades, is going to figure more and more prominently in science fiction because it is such a fascinating world. And we'll get back to that. Are there any people who are studying life possibility? She got very excited. We're going to exchange cards because Titan is amazing. All right. Nevertheless, speculation, these meager speculations aside, it certainly looks like the solar system is not going to be a great place to find life, which is, a bummer. So the question is, are there planets around other solar systems? And in 1967, this was still something of an open question. We had not settled on an origin of the solar system theory. I know that sounds crazy. It was only 55 years ago. Heck, it was only 55 years ago that plate tectonics became an established theory. It was only this year that Tennessee repealed its Scopes monkey law restriction on teaching evolution in public schools. So just 55 years, whenever you're feeling like, oh my gosh, 2022 is the worst year ever, it has never been as bad as today, let me tell you folks, 55 years ago was worse in every single way except the music. All right, so the question is, were there other solar systems? Because it really relies on two things. Is our solar system a unique phenomenon, or is it one of many? And at the time, one of the competing theories was Earth is rare, and what happened was a star passed another star and ripped some of the matter from it, and that congealed into a disk that turned into planets. And if that's the case, stellar collisions are very rare, and there would be very few planets in the solar system. But even as early as the 1700s, Laplace theorized that no, every star has a disk, and it collapses into planets. And the only reason Laplace didn't really take off is because they hadn't solved some momentum issues, which they won't solve for another couple of decades. Obviously, in 2022, protoplanetary disks are accepted fact. So the question is, in 1967, did we have evidence of any other planets around other stars? Yes. This is Peter Van de Kamp, and he had, by 1967, discovered 3 planets around 3 nearby stars, the Land 21185, 61 Cygni, and Bernard star. Those just trip off the tongue. The land 21185 is a household name today because of Peter van der Kamp. And the way he discovered these planets was the science of astrometry, which is you measure the star and see the wiggle. This isn't the radial velocity method. This is actual watching the star move around in your telescope. And so we knew in the 60s there were planets around other stars. So there was only one problem with Peter van der Kamp's discoveries, and that was they were all wrong. And the result of something wrong with his telescope, not with. So there were no planets. These planets do not exist. But we didn't know that in 1967. And we took this as license to let our imaginations run wild. Now, here's the cool thing. You don't have to just look for stars, look at stars for planets in visible light. Now that we know that there are other solar systems, we can start to make predictions about the probability of life. And everybody's seen this equation. Meaningless equation in the history of humanity, because we've got 7 variables, only 3 of which we can really nail down. So the other 4 are whatever you want them to be. You can probably, with Tessa and Kepler, and now that Jim Webb is up, we can maybe start to narrow down on F of P. But anyway, so Frank Drake decided, you know what? We don't need just visible light. Let's listen to the stars with this very new technology, radio astronomy. So if any of you have read the 3rd book in the Oz series, you know who Ozma is, the Queen of Oz. One of the first transgender heroes, actually, because she was a he in the 2nd book. And what he did was he set up a telescope in West Virginia. He didn't set it up. He contracted a telescope in West Virginia and listened for 2 months to Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani. And his thinking was, if they are broadcasting anything, we will hear it. Well, 2 months went by, he didn't hear anything. But he said, well, you know what? Really, this is going to take a good 30 years before we can make any conclusions. But this was the first attempt to listen to the stars. Of course, we don't have to stay on our planet. We can leave. And in the late 60s, we were talking about using the Saturn V moon rocket to send really giant probes to Mars. And that was the original Voyager. This eventually will get canceled and replaced by Viking, so it will have to wait until 1976 before we get some surveyor-class, on-the-ground science from Mars. But we were ambitious. We were planning on going there. All right, so this is the state of knowledge as of 1967. This is what we knew. Let's talk about what we dreamed. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. This is us going, we had plans to go out to the planets. But what if the aliens had already come to us? For instance, there's this meteorite that we found in the 1800s called the Orgueil meteorite. And we believed that there was evidence of life on this meteorite. You see the thing on the right that actually made big headlines about 30 years from the 1960s. We were certain that this was the proof that there was life outside of Earth, so common that even asteroids could have pieces of it. Turned out this was a fraud, like Piltdown Man. But we didn't know that at the time. And again, this is one of those things where we get put on the right course even for the wrong reasons. All right, well, what if the aliens visiting us are a bit more flashy about it? 1947, all of a sudden, UFOs are everywhere. Now, I'm not saying that UFOs don't exist, but I will note that reports of demonic visitation plummeted tremendously right around the time that reports of UFO visitation and abduction became popular. Coincidence? You be the judge. UFOs became very popular in the late 40s, probably because that was around the time that the Air Force was lofting things so high up that you could see them at nighttime, but lit up very brightly because they were still catching the sunlight. So what could these things be? The Air Force, NASA, so forth, they get reports every day when someone looks at Venus and goes, oh my God, that must be a UFO. Anytime you see something bright in the sky, people are going to assume it shouldn't be there. What's going to happen when Elon Musk sends up all those Starlink satellites? Are we just going to get 10 billion calls? Are we okay? Am I dying?
No, you're not. Interference.
So don't kiss this thing. So, can you still hear me? All right, I just have to be closer. In the 50s, flying saucers were legitimate science fiction. By the late 50s, they no longer were. They had moved over into crack pottery. By 1961, we have Betty and Barney Smith talking about in lurid detail about their abduction by UFOs, and they made a living on that for the next many decades of their lives. But even by 1966, we've got Walter Cronkite talking about how there are no unidentified objects in space. We knew it was nothing, and yet, you know, even 55 years from now, I assume people will still be assuming that they want to believe. So flying saucers, probably not real. Sorry. Okay, so now we go back to what I was going to say. Let's talk about what we dreamed. We personally thought aliens were going to be like. Well, we had blobs. Blobs are easy. They're big and symmetrical and scary. This is the movie The Blob. But they were also featured in science fiction. Emshwiller, Carol Emshwiller wrote a lovely story about from the perspective of the blob. So blobs make sense. We've got puppet masters, and this is a concept that will resurface time and time again. The aliens that show up and ride our backs and make us do their bidding. This is one of my favorites. So blobs and puppet masters are the things of schlock B movies. But inside the pages of magazine like Astounding, you had more nuanced, more interesting suppositions. Have any of you read this story, Omnilingual? Famous story. It's important for a lot of reasons. One, it's one of the very first stories to star a woman scientist in a non-sexualized role. She's just a woman doing her job. And this story is really neat. If you get a chance to read it, it's actually, you can find it on Gutenberg for free. It is about a Martian civilization. There's Mars again. We do not understand their language. We can't understand their culture. They've been dead for tens of thousands of years. And yet, there is a Rosetta Stone that allows us to crack the Martian code. Do you want me to spoil it for you? Okay. I won't. But if you read it, it's really interesting. I strongly recommend this. It is a hard science fiction story and well worth your time. It says it right there, H.B. Piper. Kids these days, they don't read. We have Poul Anderson again. This is an alien from a planet with a red sun, very dim, and so their eyes are very big to catch the light, and their ears big because you depend more on hearing when you can't see so well. This is a really interesting story. This is Unhuman Sacrifice by Catherine McLean. This came out in 1958, also in analog. And this has an extraterrestrial team going to a planet and finding these aliens with this strange life cycle. They live as bipedal creatures, and then there just comes a point in their life when they take the old members of this tribe and hang them by their feet from trees, leaving them somewhat hobbled for the rest of their life. What terrible, cruel people. Why would they do this? And the answer is a very interesting biological puzzle. And I strongly recommend that all of you get a chance to read Unhuman Sacrifice by Catherine McLean. And if you're wondering where you can read that, you can find it in the first volume of Rediscovery Science Fiction by Women, put out by Journey Press. This is not a plug for that. This is just a particularly interesting story with well-thought-out biology I think you'll enjoy. Have any of you read this story, Critical Point by Hal Clement? Hal Clement was another one of those extremely hard science fiction authors, and what I love about this story, this is also worth your time, it posits a planet where you've got an atmospheric density. It's 3 times the size of the Earth, so the atmospheric density is hundreds that of Earth. And we're near the critical point of water. So as the sun sets, the water coalesces from the atmosphere and the oceans rise by several meters every night. And it's all about these aliens that live essentially like at the bottom of the ocean, except the ocean is their atmosphere. Really interesting story. So even in the 50s, we were writing really nuanced, compelling, scientifically motivated stories that I suspect to some degree would stand up today. Let's go to television. Not quite as sophisticated. Does anyone know what this is? This is Doctor Who, the second serial. These are falls. Very alien-looking creatures these are. Here's some more aliens. That's the doctor and his granddaughter. They're aliens. Can't you tell? Of course, we do have the Daleks, which we actually don't know what they look like in 1964. They could be people in there. In fact, they're supposed to be mutated Thals. In fact, when you've got humans doing the acting, why not have two in a box? You're going to find this very often in 60s science fiction. Your aliens look like people. Or they're people in a suit. For instance, the first monster we see in Star Trek, this is the Man Trap, the first aired episode. This was a woman in a suit. Here's a man in a lizard suit. This is the Gorn from the episode Arena, also first season of Star Trek. This idea, this theme of the man in a suit is so prevalent. There's even an Outer Limits episode, which is an anthology show that happened around the same time as Twilight Zone, starring Martin Landau as a man in a suit who turns into a man in a suit. And that's if we're lucky. Usually what we get, these are all aliens from Star Trek. These are all non-humans, and yet they look just like you and me, maybe with little makeup on. Why is that? And this is something we don't just see in television. You actually see this all the time in the science fiction in print of the day. Well, there's two reasons. One, it's cheaper to put a person in makeup than it is to make a truly alien thing. And also, there's a matter of writing what you know, right? That's why we get people on other planets. That's why we get cat people on other planets. That's why we get fish on other planets, birds on other planets. The idea that life will evolve on other worlds in the same order they did here, from fish to amphibians to reptiles to birds to humans. There's also something a little more sinister going on here. There's a bit of translated racism. There's a sort of Terran chauvinism, human chauvinism. This idea that humanity is not only the best form, it's an inevitable form because it's the best. And so we can go out to other planets and we will find people who look exactly like us. Sound familiar? There's an element of colonialism in there, and certainly chauvinism. And no more was this espoused than in the pages of Astounding by John Campbell. A lot of great science fiction in his magazines, a lot of great discoveries in his magazines, a lot of regressive attitudes in his magazine. All right. Now, this is Star Trek. I'm making fun of it, but the fact is Star Trek does give us some interesting aliens. For instance, we have, in the first season episode, The Devil in the Dark, this is the Horta, a silicon-based life form. Now, even at the time, we were aware that silicon-based life was unlikely, certainly compared to carbon-based life. And if it existed, it would probably need extremely high temperatures to do its thing. And what solvent exists at those high temperatures? What's really exciting, especially I imagine for you, the Titan person, is now we're discovering that maybe silicon-based life thrives at very cold temperatures in nitrogen or methane-based solvents. But at the time, we didn't know that. Still, the idea that we are coming up with a truly alien life based on completely different biochemistry was exciting and new and straight science fiction, which was admirable for a TV show. In fact, if there's anything Star Trek did, was it brought science fiction to the masses. Because before then, there were a few thousand hardcore science fiction fans who wore propeller head beanies and got to conventions that numbered around 1,000. Once you have Star Trek, you start getting conventions in the tens of thousands of attendance and the millions of people watching. And in some ways, more important, you get women really participating in science fiction in a big way. But I digress. Another thing we see a lot in Star Trek is the godlike aliens, whether it's Charlie X's father on the left, or Trelane's parents in the middle, or the Metron on the right. These are aliens that are so far beyond us that they have no corporeal form unless they want one. And this, to my mind, is actually the most plausible kind of alien we will discover. Because, let's face it, if you take the entire history of humanity, the entire history, all the way to when we were definably human, say 100,000 years, say 1,000,000 years, and compare it to the age of the Earth, we are talking about something the width of a dime on top of the Empire State Building. Any aliens we find are going to be far less advanced than us or far more advanced than us, I think. Now, we see a lot of aliens in Star Trek. We see so many aliens in Star Trek that next season they're going to find it necessary to actually designate someone their astrobiologist. And so that name will come into the popular lexicon. It existed. In 1952, the Soviets had a book called Astrobiology, but in the 60s, generally it was called exobiology. I think this character, played by Diana Muldaur, named Anne Mulhall, was what made astrobiology something everybody knew. All right. So this is what we dreamed as of the 60s and what we knew as of the 60s. This was 55 years ago. The Dark Ages. Clearly, 55 years ago, we had zero evidence of aliens or even any kind of life outside the Earth. Clearly, 55 years from now, there's going to be some kind of evidence. In 2022, everybody's going to have tons of evidence of life on other planets. But we don't. We have none. We have better models, we have better instruments, we have better computers, we have more people in the field than ever before, but not one piece of evidence that any life exists beyond the Earth. Sorry to be a downer, but you guys know that. You're in this room. There's been some false alarms. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence went on, and at one point, we thought we'd gotten a signal from the stars. Turns out it was probably a reflection off a satellite. Probably of Bewitched. But nothing. And this is the state of the best radio telescope in the world. Kind of depressing. Should we give up? Are we done? Is there nothing to be found? I don't think so. And I don't think anyone in this room thinks so either. Because we are just beginning to explore the universe. 55 years ago, there were 3 planets, and they weren't even real. When I was an astronomer student in 1994, I got into exoplanets, and everyone laughed at me because it was the bottom of the totem pole. Everyone was interested in huge structures, galaxy clusters, the cosmos. Who's interested in planets? There's nothing there. And the next year, what happened? We discovered the first exoplanets, and now there are 10,000 discovered exoplanets and more every day. And we've got Tessa, and we've got Jim Webb just went up. And there's every reason to believe that our knowledge of the universe is going to expand tremendously. And even if we don't find alien life, and alien sentient life, and I don't think we will, for the reasons I said before, I don't think they're out there listening to us. Either they can't hear us because they haven't developed radio yet, or even brains yet, or they're far beyond us. I don't think we're going to find them conventionally. But I think everyone in this room would be perfectly happy if we found a microbe, if we found some kind of biochemistry that arose differently from ours to tell us so much about how chemistry and physics and biology work. That's what we're waiting for. And we keep refining our techniques and our instruments, and I think one day we will find it. And even if we don't find it, even if never find it, that's knowledge too. And in the process, we will make a map of the universe so comprehensive that we'll know as much as we possibly can. And let's face it, the one thing that gets the populace interested in what we do is the search for life. People want to find other people out there. Maybe it's that Terran chauvinism I was talking about. Maybe it's loneliness. Maybe it's hope that someone can fix our problems, that maybe someone's already fixed problems. Maybe it's just extroversion. We really want someone to talk to. Or maybe for some of us, it's just the interesting physical problem. But I think it's worth continuing for all those reasons. And I hope this talk has given you a little bit of insight, a little bit of excitement, showing you how far we've come in 55 years, and also just how groovy a time it was back then. So if you enjoyed this talk, I do this kind of thing at universities, libraries, planetaria, weddings, bar mitzvahs. So after this, feel free to get a card. We still have some time, and one of my favorite things is Q&A. So you have any questions about the 60s, the science of the time, the zeitgeist of the time, the science fiction of the time, I'm here to answer any of your questions until you get tired and want to go join me at the Tiki Bar. And now you can applaud if you want. Any questions? Mom?
Know in the 60s, hello, I'm surprised that people didn't know in the 60s that Venus was uninhabitable. I mean, couldn't you see what the composition of the atmosphere was at that time with spectroscopy?
You could tell that there was carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You could not tell the density. And there were models that suggested that you could have this thick atmosphere and still, if it operated certain ways, was not too hot on the surface. It was not until we actually went there. Mariner 2 didn't even have a camera. All it had was a magnetometer and a radiometer to see the temperature. And it wasn't until then that we knew which model was accurate, and it was the one that said that this is a really hot planet.
All right.
Sorry. Although we actually were already getting radar data at that time that suggested it was hot. We have another question, and thank you to the person delivering the microphone. It's like Uber microphone.
So, given that this was like during the Cold War, were there any sci-fi stories where the aliens are sort of preferentially siding with the Russians or the Americans?
No, actually. No, that's a good question, right? Do the aliens come and work through people? Almost invariably, the aliens are the external threat that either unites us against them or takes advantage of our internal divisions to conquer us all. Sometimes the aliens are stand-ins for the enemy. So, for instance, the Klingons are the Soviets. They're probably the Chinese. But in terms of the aliens coming down and saying, we choose Union to be our representative on this earth, sorry, Yankees. No, that actually does not happen.
Yeah, here. Hi.
Yeah,
Actually, it was Carl Sagan, the first one that got closer to the surface of the temperature of the surface Venus, right in 1960, using the radio. Because basically the idea was there is clouds, we cannot see anything, then there should be the dinosaurs or something like that. But I was going to ask you about the meteorite, because I didn't, the picture there, that was the ALH 84001 Martian meteorite, and that was in 1996, yes, yeah. So the one you mentioned, you said it was in the 60s. There was another meteorite where there were claims about life in that meteorite?
That is correct. So in the 19th century, I believe in the 1860s, there was a meteorite that fell near Orgueil, France, and became known as the Orgueil meteorite. And even from an early time, there were reports that that chemical analysis suggested there was life on this thing. And then in 1965, someone found little microbes like that. It turns out it was artificially inserted contamination.
Okay, thank you. And you should see the Santo movies in Mexico against the Martians. Those are fantastic.
So she mentions the Santo movies, El Santo. El Santo is a hero in Mexican science fiction. He's actually a luchador. And so I told you about Galactic Journey. We started with just me. Now there's 20 authors from around the world writing for this thing, including we had a correspondent from behind the Iron Curtain, and we had a Mexican writer who wrote an article about the El Santo movie. So if you go to Galactic Journey and look up El Santo, you will actually see the character that she is talking about. Thank you for bringing that up.
You didn't talk at all about Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, which was one of the most influential for me. Could you set that within the context of the time and what was known about Mars when he wrote it?
So Martian Chronicles came out in the early 50s. You're right. There was, for time constraints, I realized almost all science fiction I had to leave out if this was going to be done in less than 20 years. But yeah, I did mention All Summer in a Day for Venus. So Ray Bradbury does talk about the colonization of Mars, although that was not particularly hard science fiction. And Ray Bradbury doesn't write particularly hard science fiction. He wrote in the early 50s, what we knew about Mars was that it had a thin atmosphere. We assumed it was probably about 10% that of Earth. So it was like the highest mountains on Earth. We believed that some kind of Andean or Denver type civilization could exist. The Martian Chronicles Mars is similar to the Mars Child Mars of Cyril Judd. It was a popular, difficult but not unrealizable landscape for science fiction.
I have a question. Thank you. Thank you for the talk here. Just maybe correct me if I'm wrong. I understand that in many science fiction book, when there's other civilization, they depict them as invasive, dangerous, they are not nice, basically. And how, if this is almost correct, would you explain the apparent contradiction of we want to meet other civilization, and whenever we depict those civilizations, they are dangerous to us? And whether this can be something due to the human species that they tend to colonize, tend to be devastative. Yeah, I just would like your thoughts about that.
So it is true that science fiction, especially scary boogeyman science fiction that we see in the movie theaters, or science fiction that's designed to evoke the terror that existed at the time. We'd have to understand, it was a scary time to live in the 60s. We think it's scary now, but back then we went to sleep thinking, you know, tomorrow could be the end. All it takes is someone to push the button. It had only been 5 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis. That said, don't get a skewed view of science fiction. There are plenty of stories where the aliens are benign, friendly, we work with them. Sometimes they're more advanced than they put us on our course. Star Trek is filled with them. Larry Niven's known space universe has several aliens. The Kzinti are bad guys until we beat them enough times, and then they're our friends. The puppeteers are never bad guys, except, of course, they're manipulating all politics behind the scenes. The Kadatlino, the Pirin, they're good guys. So there are plenty of examples of science fiction of good aliens, or even completely neutral aliens, completely detached aliens. The aliens in Critical Point didn't even know we existed and had no reason to believe we existed because their environment was so different from ours. They never even saw the sky. So yes, it's true that we often see aliens as other and bad. And I think that's a bad, I hate to use the word, but I think that's a bad trope. I think it's a bad cliche. I think science fiction and horror, particularly in cinema, have gotten so closely intertwined. In space, nobody can hear you scream, right? It's always scary. Space is scary enough. We don't need aliens to make it worse. How about the alien that comes up and saves the person who gets separated from the space shuttle? That's what I want to see.
Hi. Great talk. I really enjoyed that. So I don't think I would be an astrobiologist if I didn't grow up in the 90s surrounded by the heyday of Star Trek, TNG, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. And so I really feel this feedback between science and science fiction in my own life. I was wondering, in the early 60s when it was just these stories that not that many people were reading, was there still a feedback between science and science fiction? I mean, we know that there was science that was inspiring the science fiction, but was there science fiction that was also inspiring scientists at the time?
Yes. So yeah, it is a positive feedback loop. In the 50s and the 40s, science fiction is mostly based in the solar system. 1957, Sputnik goes up, and science fiction changes overnight. Isaac Asimov leaves the field. He had been one of science fiction's brightest lights, and he goes to do science writing because what's happening in the newspapers is exciting. And all of a sudden, science fiction transitions from a planetary literature to a stellar literature. And Star Trek is born of that tradition. And then Star Trek, in turn, feeds everybody else, like you, back into it. Absolutely, back and forth. And science fiction, the whole point of science fiction is you're always on the next step, going to that cutting edge, and then inspiring the scientists to follow suit. Absolutely.
I have a question. So you've focused a lot of your examples on English-speaking examples, and you maybe a little touch on Mexico, but what were other cultures, what were the Chinese writing about in the science fiction, and maybe in the Middle East? What were their scientific, science fiction themes, and how did it parallel what was going on with the discoveries that NASA was doing, or did they go off in their own direction?
This is a fascinating question. And the answer is they weren't writing anything. In the 1950s and 60s, we have plenty of stories that could be classified today as science fiction. Nigeria was writing stories as early as 1920 that we might say is science fiction, but they were science fiction the way Frankenstein was science fiction. They were not in the central branch, the lineage of science fiction that has led to Star Trek and everything else today. In the 1950s and 1960s, the only two countries, the only two languages, I should say, that were producing new innovative science fiction were English and Russian. In the mid-60s, you start to get Japanese science fiction, literary science fiction happening. Europe, science fiction is on the decline. Obviously, Jules Verne is not English speaking. And he was hard science fiction before we had a name for the term. But in 1960s, French science fiction is actually on the decline. The magazine of fantasy and science fiction is translated into tons of languages and is the main outlet for science fiction in Europe at this time. So if you want science fiction, it's really England, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Now, that is why we had a Soviet correspondent to cover the stories that were coming out of the Soviet Union. And those do come from an interesting, different tradition. Because Soviet science fiction has to assume that sometime in the future, communism has reached its ideal, right? Right now they're stuck in socialism, but eventually communism is going to succeed, and this is the world we're going to have after communism exists. And sometimes the stories are as boring as you would imagine they would be in that kind of universe. Sometimes people manage to write interesting stories despite that requirement of Soviet science fiction. But in the 50s and 60s, we're talking about a time when most countries were still trying to figure out how to exist. Israeli science fiction, for instance, doesn't really come into existence until the 90s. Partly because the idea was, look, we are too busy making a country. We don't have time to dream about this frivolous stuff. I have a friend, Ogunechove, who's the first Nigerian to be a Hugo finalist. Really great guy. And I talked to him about this very topic. When did these other countries develop a science fiction tradition? And the answer is a long time ago, if you include like folklore or allegory type stories. But if you're talking direct lineage from the magazine of fantasy and science fiction and Galaxy and Analog, and then now they have their own science fiction periodicals and they're writing conventional science fiction, that's a very recent phenomenon in Nigeria and in a lot of other places. I hope that answered the question.
The question that I had was exactly along these lines, in that we had our rivals, and I was going to ask, what was Soviet science fiction like? And you've answered that, and that it was very much like socialist realism, which could be as boring as one can possibly imagine. Novels like Cement being really the best of the genre. However, it is also true that by the early 70s, you had people, real geniuses like Tarkovsky, making science fiction that was at least as serious as the most serious science fiction films made here in the West. And so he couldn't have just come out of nowhere. So what was maybe happening in the 60s in Soviet science fiction literature? Was there, could it be predicted that movies of the quality that Tarkovsky made in the 70s were going to come out of that country?
Absolutely. You've got the Strugatsky brothers. If you go to Galactic Journey and you look up the Soviet Union, if you just do a search for Soviet Union, Not only do we have a couple of collections of stories that came out of the Soviet Union, which is what they assumed would be the most sellable here. They figured it was their best and maybe the most appealing to a Western audience. But a lot of Soviet movies came out in the late 50s, early 60s and got dubbed into English. And a lot of those have more interesting stories than their contemporaries in the West. They were big budget. They were big science friendly. They often posited a united Earth. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they would have a northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere, which would be analogs to capitalism versus communism. But absolutely, in the 60s, Soviet science fiction is a going concern, and we knew that. And in 66, Sagan co-writes a book, sort of, with, I cannot remember the name, I just read about it. But they write a book in 66 talking about life beyond the solar system. And it's an interesting collaboration because what it really is they both wrote books and then they sort of put them together and did commentary on each other. I cannot remember the name of the book, but it came out in 66.
I grew in the 1970s reading a lot of Spanish stories from Spain, and I was amazed of so many authors. Usually they use a English pseudonym. I remember one series of stories, the Galaxy 2000, where there were stories about planets and in visiting astronauts and other planets. And my question is this something that is now ignored, or there people are translating? It was not that popular. So the stories was in 1960s. And
Are you asking if in 2022 there are people translating these older stories?
well, you said that the language that for this science fiction was only popular from English and Russian. But for me, I got the impression that they were in Spanish were very popular, at least from Spain. So is this something that is unknown, or also people are keeping a track of these stories and translating them? Anyway.
Not in the 60s. So I must confess, my knowledge of science fiction in the 70s and 80s and 90s is more limited than my knowledge of science fiction from the early 50s to the 60s. And that's by design. Part of the charm and the import of Galactic Journey is we review the stories in context. Now, obviously, we know we're writing for a modern audience, so we make sure that you're interested, and occasionally we have little winks. But for the most part, we try to understand why people were writing these stories back then. And as a result, I don't even know who's going to win the Hugos in 1967. And if anyone spoils me, I will be very upset. So I can't tell you what we thought of Spanish science fiction in the 70s because I'm not there yet. I would guess that the 70s would be about the time that European science fiction, Italian, Spanish, French, German. All right, so I've given the German short shrift. We have a German correspondent. I should say we have a West German correspondent, and that's Cora Bullard. She's also been on the ballot for the Hugo Fan Writer many times. So I've been utterly remiss. There is German science fiction. In fact, there is a German show, you could call it the German answer to Star Trek, except that it came out completely independently, and that was called Space Patrol Orion. There were only 7 episodes, only 1 season, but it was brilliant, and I believe you can get your hands on it through some streaming network. So look for Space Patrol Orion, Raumpatrol Orion. The Germans absolutely had a science fiction tradition, and mea culpa.
Here, me again. Latin America has a long history of science fiction too, since the 19th century. So it's, I think it's, I mean, I know we have a lot of problems and we have to think about those problems, but one way of thinking about those problems is writing about the future. So we do have, so maybe, I wouldn't say that China or, I don't know, other countries in Asia or Africa don't have science fiction, because it's just like we have been colonized and our histories have been deleted purposely by white people. So I would be careful saying those kind of things.
And I don't want to, let me say this better. Thank you for that. There are plenty of genres that are native to many countries. Every country has its literary tradition, and these are necessarily different from an English science fiction tradition. So when I say that there is not science fiction in these other languages, I'm not saying there is not a literary tradition and that there's not speculative elements in these writings. All I'm saying is that there's a very specific genre that is the Western science fiction story. And that genre is worldwide now and is being contributed specifically by countries all over the world. That particular genre was not being participated in by other languages at that time, or other countries at that time. That particular thread of it, if that makes sense. Not trying to move the goalpost.
So I know you've been, I know you've been concentrating on seasons.
Oh, and before you go on, I would actually very much love if you have some names. I would love to be educated as to the authors that you are referring to, because I would love to know more about them.
So you've been concentrating on the 1950s and 60s. How do you see Lovecraft as a influencer of modern science fiction?
Well, Lovecraft is 20s and 30s. I've actually, as it turns out, I'm not, my knowledge of science fiction before 1950 is fairly thin, with the exception of Edgar Rice Burroughs and H.P. Lovecraft. I've actually read every single thing that guy ever wrote, including like letters to editors. I was a masochist for a couple of years. H.P. Lovecraft wrote 3 excellent stories and a bunch of rough drafts for those stories he kept publishing over and over in magazines. H.P. Lovecraft was huge, but he didn't write science fiction. He wrote weird tales, specifically for the magazine, Weird Tales. The closest he comes to science fiction, I would say, is The Mountains of Madness, which features aliens in Antarctica. And I think that's influenced some things. You could argue that maybe that influenced John Campbell's Who Goes There, which ultimately influenced the 1982 John Carpenter The Thing movie. H.P. Lovecraft's influence on the genre was profound. But again, just as I was saying that these other countries were not producing science fiction, H.P. Lovecraft was not producing what we call this science fiction genre, which honestly hardly existed at the time. We mostly found it in places like Amazing. In the late 20s, it was a very new genre.
Hi, so just so happens that I was speaking to another scholar of science fiction recently who posited the theory that science fiction is basically humanity's way of trying to express and explore an inherent contradiction in our progress in technology and our progress in science. So technology gives us these amazing tools to manipulate the world to our whims, whereas scientific discoveries such as, other exoplanets and the laws of thermodynamics that say everything's decaying towards entropy make us feel small and actually powerless and very insignificant in this grand universe. So science fiction was this exploration, essentially, emerged as this exploration of these contrasting results of our increasing technological prowess and our increasing smallness in the universe. And I was wondering what you thought about this theory.
It's interesting, the idea that science fiction is the pretty face we draw on the universe because the universe is too complicated to understand and scary in its complexity. That's certainly one of the motivations. I mean, we have to remember the primary motivation for the existence of science fiction is to make money. Larry Niven, when he was selling his story, well, maybe not you because you were rich to begin with, but you probably did it for the fanish love of it all. There's a lot of reasons to write science fiction. One, but ultimately the point is to tell a story. And science is the core of science fiction. We love extrapolating. Sometimes we like making social commentary. Sometimes we express analogs in science fiction that aren't safe to do in our regular fiction. So we talk about the green people instead of the brown people. And sometimes we are making cautionary stories. So I did a talk at Georgia Tech in October, which is kind of the reason I'm here today, called doomsday predictions of the past and how we make and why they didn't come true and how we make the future. And in the 60s, we believed that overpopulation, pollution, nuclear annihilation, these were things that were going to destroy us if they went on. Now, no science fiction person is a soothsayer. We don't know the future because, again, we're mostly writing to make a buck, maybe to make a statement. But what we can do is say, you know what? This thing looks like a bad idea. Let's write stories about what the world looks like if this goes on. And then the world can look at these stories, read them, and go, huh, well, I didn't really understand the problem until it was conveyed to me in this easily digestible form of a story or a movie. Now that I've seen Soylent Green, maybe I am going to be an advocate for birth control. All right, this is the last question. Lisa wants to go to the bar.
Can you hear me? Are there any examples, fiction writers, predicting, and these are writers, these are not scientists, but writers making predictions about the future, and then that actually becoming technologically true, but they were artists making the interpretation, not the scientists?
Star Trek, of course, is a stellar example, although in some cases it's a matter of the people inspired by Star Trek then created the technologies they saw in the show. Do you ever watch the show Green Hornet? Green Hornet came out the same year as the Batman 66. That one. By the same people, William Dozier, and it was supposed to be the serious alternative to Batman. And it's a great show, and it's really kind of criminal that it's not better remembered. It only lasted one season. There's even a couple of crossover episodes with Batman. And if you watch it, one of the things that their version of the Batmobile, called the Black Beauty, has is that it has these little flying things come out of the trunk and fly soundlessly overhead with cameras on board so you can see what's below you. You may have seen these in real life in the 21st century, but this was astonishing when I first saw this in 1967. You absolutely see plenty of things predicted in science fiction. Partly they're educated guesses. If you have a million monkeys riding on a million typewriters, they will guess the name of the president in 2022. For the most part, though, science fiction people are guessing as much as anybody else. Sometimes we know a little more. There was a guy who wrote a fantasy and science fiction story just the other day, and it was about transplanting knowledge into the brain. And this guy knew whereof he spoke because he actually had invented the first remote control pacemaker. So there are some people who are actually scientists writing science fiction who knew enough about the state of the art, and they could write some pretty intelligent science fiction, some of which came true, some of which didn't. For the most part, the people who wrote science fiction were not scientists. We would just read Scientific American, find some cool ideas, and turn a story from it. Larry Niven was one of the masters of taking a science fiction article or an Isaac Asimov article and turning that into this week's Hugo winner. I think that's it. If you guys want to know more about me and what I do, if you want to see Galactic Journey or the books we publish, come up here and get a card. Even if you throw the card away, make me feel better.